The reality that you specifically are aligning with corresponds to your resonant frequency. That is it. So your frequency consists of your dominant beliefs and your emotions, and then what you're focusing on. And then your identity is the tie-in as well with all of that. You basically are emitting, like I said, a wave of information, like you're broadcasting energy constantly, depending on what you're holding in your mental plane and what emotions you are emitting. One thing I really want you to get from this is physical reality being the lowest form of consciousness means that there's nothing that comes after physical reality or matter as we perceive with our senses. And so the reason that most of us end up in a frequency of limitation is because we allow ourselves to be programmed by the lowest form of consciousness, which is an end effect. So think of it like this. Okay, if we look at the spiritual plane as God, the infinite mind, the source, we look at us on the mental plane as humans with a more limited perspective, but we still have the creative consciousness of God within us. And then we look at the physical plane of matter. You looking at a circumstance of lack and limitation and saying, this means that I'm lack and limitation, is like God looking at a human being and saying, this means that I'm not good enough. This means that I'm broke. Okay, so a higher form of consciousness should never be bowing to a lower form of consciousness to dictate its truth and to dictate its state. But that's the game that we're playing here. Okay, that's why we're here. It's for the expansion of our souls, to feed light back into the source, whatever way you want to call it. But the game that we're playing is to overcome the tendency to base our consciousness off the lowest form, which is matter. And this is how you start accessing, I'm going to make this more tangible in a moment, but this is like the energetic stuff that you need to understand. How you start accessing the invincibility frequency, and you create a frequency that's so strong that it doesn't get swayed by reality, is you stop basing your beliefs, your emotions, your identity, your state off of physical reality. You decide it internally for yourself, okay? That's how you shift out of a created state of consciousness, a created frequency of limitation, and you start tapping into a creative state of consciousness. You start having that invincibility cloak of dictating your energy, and then that dictates your reality. To give you another perspective, Kabbalah speaks about this a lot as well, but there's different dimensions in terms of our universe. And we can see us as human beings, we're connected to all dimensions, like I mentioned, because we're part of the whole, okay? We're part of the source. Everything that exists, this pen, this physical body, everything, your thoughts, your mind, your emotions, everything exists within the all, the creative consciousness. The infinite mind, okay? God, source, okay? So you exist within that, so you are part of that. You're landing on kind of the fourth dimension because that's where your mental plane is. But you also obviously exist simultaneously on this third dimension, which is a lower dimension, the material world, the world of matter. So you're able to exist at this moment in time in this physical body because of this creative spiritual consciousness that exists within you. Without it, you would just be neurological tissue and flesh. There would be no life in your body. So I think it was Joe Dispenza who said, when consciousness is directed at neurological tissue, it becomes mind. And when consciousness is directed at potential, it becomes an experience. And the key component in here is consciousness, okay? So consciousness is the creative power of our reality. It is like the way that everything actually exists. And when we look at quantum mechanics and the observer effect, essentially, every single particle that makes up matter, the things that are so tangible and so important to us, our consciousness is infused with that because quantum mechanics shows us that basically, electrons exist in many possible states in superposition of each other, like waves and fields of information, until they're observed by a conscious external observer, and then they behave like particles. So our consciousness, our creative consciousness that comes from the source, is bound to what we perceive as matter, which means you are cause, and matter is simply effect. If science has shown us that the atoms, the stuff that builds, the stuff that we call matter, is influenced by our consciousness, don't you think you should start prioritizing your consciousness then? And this is why I say mind precedes matter, okay? If you get your energy right, if you get your frequency right, no external circumstance can stand in the way of that, because it is an effect of your energy. So, your problem is you've been taking matter too seriously, and that's why you have not had a strong enough frequency to make your reality obey you. You've been obeying reality far too much. And how you start shifting that is you start taking your frequency and your energy and your state more seriously than you take physical reality. You have one opponent, however, when it comes to operating in this invincible frequency that can bend reality. You have one opponent, and this opponent is the reason why you might be watching this right now thinking, I don't know if I believe that, but what about this situation? But what about that situation? But why isn't it easy? Why can't I just do that? The opponent is the reason that you can't just step back from reality and let it go. The opponent is the reason that you can't place your frequency and your energy on a higher level of importance than physical reality. And that opponent is the ego self. The ego self is your opponent because the ego self has been created by the material world. So when your soul landed in your physical body and you opened your eyes, you began to be programmed. The ego began to be programmed by external reality. So the parent of the ego self, which most people are operating from the ego self. The parent of the ego self is the world, is matter, is the material world around you. And so this is always the created self. And because the ego was created by the external world, the ego will always take the external world seriously because that is the ego's parent. So the ego will always feed into lack, limitation, circumstances, and it's always trying to please external reality. So that's why, even if we look at chakras and energy centers, that's why the lower three energy centers are the centers of the ego. And they essentially have like the traps and pitfalls that the most of society have. It's like the dominant consciousness of the earth is operating in the ego, in the lower energy centers, and is caught up in things that the majority deem important, such as status, such as material gain, money, all of this stuff. Those are all ego desires that the consensus and the majority of reality have deemed important. And so the majority of the reality end up chasing these things, not realizing that it's the ego self seeking to please the world and please society. And it's not actually truth and it's not actually alignment. It's just you operating from limitation and from programming. So this is like the character that you've been programmed with in this material world. And let me just say, your ego isn't necessarily negative. I know I'm speaking about it like it's negative. It's not necessarily negative. You just have to have awareness and control over it, and then you can use it to your advantage. So like a character in a video game, you don't want to just run around thinking you're the character, because if you're a character stuck at a certain level in this game of life and you want to go to another level, you need to be able to change the character that you're playing and unlock new traits, i.e. a new frequency, to be able to access that next level. And so for you to do that, you have to realize that you're not just this character. You are also